If you have reached the point in Final Fantasy XIV where you either think you're ready for some Savage raiding, or you're wondering how to figure out whether you are ready, but regardless are uncertain of where to start, you have come to the right place. We'll be going over all the things you need to advance to Savage raiding, how to prepare you so you don't show up feeling like you missed something, and even going over how to figure out which way of approaching Savage raiding is best for you. But before anything else, an important question is why you're looking to advance to harder content. Not necessarily Savage, could just be extremes. Some players finish the main story, finish the optional dungeons and normal raids, essentially having exhausted the casual difficulty content in the game, and look to Savage simply because that's the next thing on the list. Other players choose to get into extremes and Savage specifically because they want a challenge, and yet others get into it because they want a specific reward, like a mount, a cool outfit, or just better gear. Depending on a combination of your personal skill level as well as motivation for doing hard content, this can be a deciding factor on whether hard content, or more specifically Savage raiding, is something you should even seek out. An important thing to keep in mind is that Savage raids are entirely optional content and is in its own secluded bubble, where the only thing Savage raids can bar you from accessing is ultimates, which is even harder content that you probably have no interest in if Savage raids are not something you're into. My advice here is that if you're getting into hard content seeking a challenge, then go for it. This might be exactly what you desire. However, if you're here to get better equipment, just to have better equipment, consider that this better equipment is typically only better for 2 major patches, after which you have to do this all over again. This can be very frustrating if you force your way through this difficult content for the gear reward and not the journey. Similarly, if you're in it for a potential mount or other cosmetic reward, remember that it can take many clears before you get your reward. So again, if you're not enjoying it, I know it sounds a bit crazy, but it might actually be better for you to simply wait until the next expansion, where this particular duty will be significantly easier to overcome unsynced. And finally, if you're looking to get into hard content simply because it is the next step as far as you can see, hey, maybe you'll like it, maybe you won't. But the important part is to only continue onward if you actually find it fun. To that end, let's start with how you even unlock access to hard content. Pretty consistently, the only requirement to unlock an extreme or savage duty is to have fully completed the normal, or hard, version of that same duty. For ultimate, you have to complete the final boss of the savage raid tier that happened to coincide with that ultimate's release period. That's pretty much it. The second thing, now that you have access to the hard content, is probably when is the right time to start savage raiding? Should I wait until the next tier? And to that, if you want to savage raid, the best time you can start is today. Sometimes today will be on the release day of a savage raid tier. Sometimes today will be 2 months down the line. Sometimes it'll be 4 or 6 months down the line. The thing is, unless the next raid tier is like literally coming out tomorrow, tomorrow will be a worse day to start than today. The common reasoning is that the further in a given raid tier's relevant time period you get, the less players are interested in doing it from the very start with a first-timer. And the less first-timers there are to do it with. However, the longer you wait, the more this becomes true. At the same time, if you have 0 savage raiding experience and start on day 1 of a new raid tier, you might be overwhelmed, as many of the players rushing out on day 1 do not have the patience for a rookie. For that reason, even if a new tier is coming out next week, trying what you have available to you today is always a good idea. So, now that we have covered the subjects of purpose and interest, let's go over where to actually start. A common question I've been asked by players wanting to get into Savage is, how do you know when you are ready? The hard truth here is, you don't. You will probably know for sure when you enter Savage duty and figure out that you've totally got this. Or you don't. However, a way to test your skill is to try and beat the current Unreal trial, which is typically, not always, but typically, easier than the other hard content on offer. Unreals are unlocked in Idleshare. Depending on how that goes, you can advance to some of the currently accessible extremes of the current expansion, or even go to specifically the newest one and see how that goes. If you overcome both of these tests, your next step would be Savage rating. Alternatively, if you feel these suggestions sound too intimidating, you can try the final Savage and Extreme duties from the previous expansion unsynced, as they will typically still require a bit, if not a bunch of strategy to defeat reliably, but will have much lower stakes. Ultimately, trying different things to test your ability to overcome these challenges is the best way to figure out for yourself whether you are or are not ready for Savage. The next step then is to prepare yourself for the content you aim to do, whether it is current extreme or Savage stuff, or something else. First, decide on what role and job you wish to play. Because of the weekly limitations on multiple of the gear sources you may rely on in hard content, being too broad in your choice will make you unable to properly maintain your equipment on all the jobs you wish to play. Furthermore, each job may approach a hard fight in a vastly different way, so constantly switching while learning a fight can make it very difficult for the information to properly stick. Ultimately, the main factor in choosing your main job and role is to choose the one you enjoy the most. However, if you are choosing between several, considerations such as which jobs are more popular or roles that tend to be harder to get filled can weigh in. For tanks and healers, for instance, being able to play 2 in the role decently well can be helpful if you plan to raid through Party Finder, as it enables you to swap to your secondary to join a party that already has your primary. This technically also applies to DPS, but may less frequently come up as relevant. My advice is to take the job that you find the most enjoyable, and if possible, the easiest to maneuver, as both of these things will help you in these harder fights. Second, aim to at least get the best gear that is reasonably accessible to acquire for yourself. Depending on the content, you may not need this gear to beat the content, but being as prepared as you can helps lessen the burden and is also simply considerate to the group. In the first half of a raid tier, meaning the even major patches, crafted gear will be available, which is typically seen as the minimum gear to bring for Savage. Getting a full set of this is a solid starting point. In the second half of the raid tier, the odd patches, this crafted gear can be augmented for an additional 10 item levels, which becomes the new ground level expectation. There are other ways to obtain even better gear in both cases, such as the weekly tombstones and the coins from Alliance raids. However, those have weekly limitations, and so are only so helpful if you want to Savage raid today, right? It is relevant, however, to consider spending your weekly tombstones and coins on optimal equipment, which is often most easily done by looking up a best in slot list for your job and getting the pieces listed there. A small extension of this gearing process is that loot works a bit differently in hard content. Specifically, extremes will drop weapons and can be farmed to your heart's content. But current Savage tiers, outside of super late in the tier, have rather strict restrictions on loot. First, each boss must be defeated in order. If you skip a boss by joining a party later in the sequence, you forfeit potential loot from the earlier bosses. You will not be able to circle back and get loot from them later. Second, killing the boss spends your loot opportunity for the week. The loot that comes from that chest is the team's loot, and whoever wins are the only ones that get something. If 1 to 4 players in your party already spent their loot opportunity before this clear, the chest will only have half as much loot as normal. And if 5 or more players already spent their loot opportunity, there will be no loot whatsoever. This is another reason why it can be hard to maintain equipment for multiple roles at a time. Also note that beating a Savage boss for the first time each week gives you a tome that is used to purchase loot from the boss, although you will need multiple tomes to buy one piece of equipment. The next step in preparing for hard content is having the right consumables. In hard content, it is commonly expected that everyone, in addition to having decent equipment, has relevant and appropriate buff food. Part of the reason for this is that it is relatively cheap, but also because the sheer amount of vitality provided by food buffs can often be what enables you to survive both unavoidable damage and mistakes. If you're not sure what the relevant buff food is, those are often also listed in the best in slot lists, but alternatively, go to a market board, check meals, and find the highest item level food with vitality on it, and find the one that matches the stats you would want, for example, crit and determination. Make sure to buy high quality, they give more vitality. The second consumable is the so-called Gem Draft, also known as Burst Potions. These boost your main attribute temporarily, which can massively increase your damage during burst windows. These are mainly expected in groups aiming to clear the boss, or for re-clears or farming groups. When you're still learning the earlier parts of the fight, it is often seen as a waste to spend gem drafts, as the limiting factor is not the boss's HP. Yet, anyway. If you seem to be close to reaching clearing potential, bringing some gem drafts just in case is a good idea though. The third consumable, you could say, is to make sure you have relevant materia in your equipment. This is simply a way to bring more stats than you would otherwise have. But in the same ways as with gem drafts, technically, materia will often mainly impact your ability to do more damage, so it could be argued that they aren't initially needed. It is, however, often expected to have regular melts simply because it is considered relatively cheap. If you could afford a crafted set of gear, you can probably afford this too. Overmelding is not required. After that, your next step to prepare for hard content is to consider looking up a guide for the specific fight you aim to clear. If you aim to do the content blind, meaning without looking up guides or getting advice on it, that's a completely different beast, but I don't recommend doing your first hard content entirely blind. A good starting point is looking at guides that are more commonly referenced and used. For example, at the time of making this guide, Hector guides, by Hector Hectorson here on YouTube, are often referenced, and many strategies are either exactly those strategies or built from them, and, if nothing else, still gives you an overview of every mechanic and a suggestion on how to resolve them. Depending on what region you are in, the way strategies are communicated and positions are distributed can vary a bit. The four common, to my knowledge, ways strategies are decided and explained in parties are 1. Shorthands in the party description. This can be something as simple as naming the exact guide the strategy is based on, or something like a shorthand for an order in which a mechanic is handled. If you have a general understanding of the fight, simply asking when inside the group might give you the information you need to understand how their strategy might deviate from the norm or what you know. 2. Raid plan. Some groups will put a raid plan link in their description, which you can follow. Careful following links from strangers. Make sure the link looks right, to see exactly how the strategy they plan to use is done in detail. This can often be an extension of the shorthands in party description for cases where the individual mechanics are either too many or too complicated to explain briefly, or both. 3. Macro pastes. When you join the group or enter the duty, a player, usually the leader, pastes a macro in the party chat, which describes each mechanic that requires specific player positions to be dealt with properly, showing indicators for where each player is meant to be. This usually includes the shorthands MT, OT, H1, H2, M1, M2, R1, R2. However, the tank spots can sometimes be replaced with T1 and T2 or MT and ST, a second tank instead of off tank. Similarly, the damage dealer slots can sometimes be replaced with D1 to 4, with 3 and 4 referring to the ranged. After the macro paste is sent, you simply announce which appropriate spot you want. Meaning, for example, if you would really like to have the spots the tanks get, if you're a ranged DPS, you kinda have to take the ranged DPS spots. Unless there are 3 ranged DPS, in which case one range typically goes in a melee spot. 4. Marker dance. Usually used instead of macro pastes, but solves a similar problem. Instead, markers are placed down to decide the various positions. For example, if a mechanic requires the raid to pair up 2 by 2, each marker can indicate each pair. This can sometimes be more flexible, since you could have vastly different positions for each mechanic based on the marker dance, where macro pastes decide all your positions on one callout. The unfortunate reality is that in terms of actually getting this part of doing hard content, whether extremes or savage, is somewhat down to how well you can follow these things on the fly. As you can probably see, you might not even know how a strategy is decided before you have already joined a group. The positive is that these things are somewhat region-based and somewhat duty-based. Whether raid plan is used often comes down to how complicated a fight is. And whether macro pastes or marker dances are used usually comes down to where you are. EU region, in my experience, prefers macro pastes. NA region prefers marker dance, but anything can happen really. Which leads us to the final step. How do you decide how to approach savage raiding? Party finder or a static? Each has their upsides and downsides. My first suggestion is, if you are not yet sure if you want to do savage raiding, I highly recommend for your own peace of mind to start with Party Finder, at least for one session, before looking for a static. This way, if you try it and find that you don't really like it, you can simply not go again. If you join a static on the other hand, you might feel stuck because you don't want to let this team down, even though you don't even want to be there. The important part when making this initial run of Savage is to focus on the combat, because if you don't want to Savage raid as a result of a mean Party Finder group, that might mean you lose out on something you actually would enjoy. Once you know that you want to do more Savage raiding, the next step is deciding how. With Party Finder, you can effectively raid whenever you can, as long as a group of 8 can be collected. This makes Party Finder excellent if your schedule is unreliable. As the groups are comprised of you and 7 random strangers typically, gear is usually distributed based entirely on a random roll on each item, as in casual content. So sometimes you get nothing, sometimes you get one thing, sometimes you get 2 or more. This can be great if you're lucky and terrible if you're not. Some groups might go with slightly nicer rules, such as take from left, where the loot is distributed from left to right and the winner leaves to not be able to roll on more stuff. But as far as I know, this is exceptionally rare outside of the JP region. In terms of groups, Party Finder obviously can mean anything. Sometimes you get a group of amazing players. Other times you get a group of terrible players. And sometimes you get a mix. So the benefits of Party Finder is in the flexibility of going whenever you want and being able to join various groups, so you're not stuck with a bad group, combined with the absolute chaos of the loot distribution and, well, group distribution. Statics, on the other hand, can be a lot better if you have a reliable schedule, or at least one that is reliable enough for the group you wish to join. One big benefit is that, as it is the same group every time, you might not need to discuss strategy at all once a fight is beaten, as you just do it the same as last time. Another big benefit is that since it is a consistent team, you can be more considerate with loot distribution, which can make when you get your upgrades more reliable. It makes the swings in loot distribution less crazy, but greatly increases consistency. The main downsides of statics is that you could end up joining a group with a very different skill or motivation level to yours, and that could make your efforts feel wasted. Another downside is also, simply put, that it can be insanely difficult to find a static that works for you. There are many ways to approach it, and each person finds their own way. I can, however, give a few suggestions on how to go about looking. Technically, there is an official website for looking for raid groups in Final Fantasy XIV, which is one approach. Sometimes statics will post up in Party Finder with what they're looking for. They typically list in the None category. There are subreddits dedicated to making statics, and there are also Discords dedicated to this. Sometimes you might also find Party Finder groups that are about to do their sessions that might be missing members or looking for replacements, and sometimes you can end up in a static that way. The simplest way I can put it is that finding a static that is just right for you can sometimes be harder than actually beating a savage raid. Now, maybe you have some tips of your own to share about how to get into savage raiding. Maybe a story about how you found your static, or why you prefer Party Finder. Maybe you feel I overlooked something or that something required a bit more detail. I would love to hear about it all in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, in the past, Savage bosses would drop 2 treasure chests, each with 1/2 the loot in them. When you had players that already had gotten their clear for the week in the group, one of the chests would simply disappear, effectively removing half the loot. This is commonly why parties that accept helpers that have already gotten their clear sometimes are referred to as one-chest runs, despite the current rate tier always dropping only 1 chest of loot, and the actual loot inside it is determined by the amount of players without a weekly clear yet.